Morning, everybody. So if you could think of a word, if you could boil down Christianity, why we're here, what we do, with one word, boil it down to one word, I think we'd be hard pressed to find a better word than forgiveness. We just partook of the Lord's Supper. Forgiveness is at the core of our faith. Forgiveness is why Jesus came to earth and died for us. And because this whole idea of forgiveness is pretty much the backbone of Christianity, there are some pretty severe warnings to us if we don't forgive. I gave a version of this sermon back in December of 2018, and I've been wanting to do it again, but revise some things, and so that's what we're going to go through this morning. It's of a dreadful account of what happened in an Amish schoolhouse on October 2nd, 2006. And I'll just tell you, this is going to be a heavy sermon because it's a heavy subject. And I want to clarify that by me spotlighting this religious sect, I'm not giving credence to their doctrinal stance on everything that they believe. My primary admiration for these people is the purposefulness by which they live out their beliefs, a purposefulness that is woven into the fabric of their lifestyles. The diligence that they've shown in how they raise their children can best be described as a living example of Deuteronomy 6. They work hard to protect their children from Satan's corruptions, which deepens the tragedy of what happened, since it was their children whom Satan went after. What makes them a good illustration for this morning's lesson on forgiveness traces back to how, since their beginnings in the early 1500s, they've been literalists in their religious emphasis. They consider themselves to be neither Catholic nor Protestant, but rather restorationists to the early church practice and doctrine. They go about it differently than we do, but that's what they consider themselves. They strive to plainly live out the teachings of the Bible, particularly the Sermon on the Mount. Now, the Anabaptists were fiercely hated by the Catholic Church, with a similar hatred that we see today against believers in Jesus by the radical Muslim community. The Catholic Church wasn't merely set on exterminating them. They sought as much pain as possible while doing so. One of those seemingly radical, I'll say radical because in God's eyes it's not radical, but in a lot of our eyes sometimes it is. One of those seemingly radical teachings from Jesus speaks of the intensity of forgiveness and rejecting vengeance, which frames the focus for this morning's sermon. The engraving that you see on the screen is very popular in their circles. It depicts an early Anabaptist named Dirk Willems, who was being pursued by Catholic authorities. Now, while being chased, Dirk ran across thin ice and made it safely to the other side, to the other bank. Now, his pursuer was heavier, and he fell through the ice and was crying for help. While looking from his side of the river, Dirk noticed that the man's companions were unwilling to risk their lives to help him. So compassion moved Dirk to ignore his own peril and to walk back across the ice and pull the drowning man out of the water and onto the bank to safety. Despite the objections from the man whose life Dirk saved, his companions apprehended Dirk and they drug him off to jail. Dirk was later burned at the stake for refusing to recant of his beliefs. And so both their historical and contemporary practice of literal obedience to the teachings that we find hard to put into practice sometimes. This reveals why the dynamics surrounding the nickel mines tragedy presents an example of forgiveness that I think we can all learn from. Now, there's a question that atheists use in their attempts to discredit the reality of God's existence. This question has likewise troubled many who experience deep loss, and in their tribulation, they gave up on God and they fell away from the faith. And it's the question of suffering, the question of suffering. During moments of suffering, perhaps the most common question uttered is why? For example, why did God allow an innocent girl to be abducted and later her body was found in the woods? Why did a Christian husband and father whose family depended upon him die in a head-on collision with a drunk driver? Why was Hitler, Lenin, Mao, Pol Pot, why were they allowed to continue in their atrocities? Why did not God stop them? What purpose did this all serve? We tend to accept suffering more readily if we could assign a divine purpose to it all. For example, the unbelieving husband who finally sought God after receiving a sobering medical report. In contrast, the more disturbing instances of suffering are when it seemed to be totally senseless. Does suffering serve any legitimate eternal purpose in our lives? What about when we suffer for no apparent fault of our own? Where is the lesson in that? We know from Job's account that things happen in the unseen realm that we have no visibility into. Now, occasionally, retrospect can enlighten us on some of the why. And while God doesn't do or cause evil, sometimes he doesn't always stop it from happening. Now imagine a college professor, and he's extremely frustrated with his students. He laments to them, "Why don't you get this? It's not difficult. It's not a difficult concept to understand. Yes, it's hard to apply, but you're just not putting your heart into it. And if you don't get it, you will fail the final exam." Now, I don't like to put words into God's mouth. I don't like when writers do that. But that said, in the spirit of writers like C.S. Lewis, bear with me as I share what I can imagine could have been going on in the unseen realm just prior to the horrendous tragedy at Nickel Mines. I imagine God looking down on his people with disappointment, and he laments, "Why are you not forgiving others? It's not a difficult concept. My son both explained and illustrated it plain as day to you. For if you forgive others for their transgression, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others, then your Father will not forgive your transgressions." And to demonstrate how to apply this, my son even asked me to forgive the men who were mistreating him, who crucified him as he was dying in excruciating pain on the cross. You need to get this, because if you don't, despite all your religious acts of devotion, you cannot spend eternity with me. And I imagine God asking, what must I allow to happen to get this truth through to you? On October 2nd, 2006, in the community of Nickel Mines, Pennsylvania, Charles Carl Roberts, a mentally disturbed man, shot 11 school children and then himself at a one-room Amish schoolhouse. Robert's suicide note revealed that he held a grudge against God for the death of his infant daughter 8 years prior. As a milk truck driver who served the Amish dairy farms in the area, the sight of happy Amish children who did not meet the same fate as his own child seeded a festering bitterness in his heart. which led him to want to take vengeance on God. It was such a deep bitterness that ultimately led him to a plan to commit unspeakable horror to these innocent girls. Roberts and his wife grew up in a Pentecostal church and were members in 1998 when they lost a baby. The key to Roberts' anger seemed to be the loss of something that he considered an entitlement. And that entitlement was his infant daughter. People sometimes have a warped sense of entitlement, thinking that they can make a deal with God, such that if they obey him, that God somehow is expected to keep his end of the bargain by blessing their lives. But then what happens when tragedy strikes their lives? They get mad at God, blaming him for breaking his end of the bargain. Then disappointment knows no bounds. Unchecked, this disappointment metastasizes as bitterness, then to wrath, and in the case of Roberts, plans to get back at God for breaking his end of the bargain. This lust for the ultimate satisfaction of injury, if not somehow checked, can ooze a hellish vengeance that overwhelms the fear of hell itself. To trade a moment's satisfaction for an eternity of torment is insanity. But insanity and irrationality are precisely the roots of unforgiveness, the fruits of wrath, especially for someone like Roberts, who was brought up with Bible influence. But keep in mind that Bible influence does not guarantee Bible obedience. This tragedy thus illustrated a vivid contrast between this man's unbridled bitterness over losing a child and the merciful response of the parents whose children he massacred. The world was dumbfounded by the apparent lack of bitter reaction from the Amish community. Herman Bontrager, a prominent Lancaster County Mennonite, spent numerous hours interviewing with the media about Amish life. Now, many reporters seemed dissatisfied, was his observation, dissatisfied that they could not force any of the Amish they interviewed into defensiveness. Bontrager noted reporters seemed as if they were becoming distracted, even introspective, as they encountered a consistent element of forgiveness amongst the Amish. Within the media, there was a note of surprise, as though forgiveness this radical was impossible. And the media staff didn't know how to deal with it. In spite of the apparent senselessness of this atrocity, the Christ-like reaction of those who were most closely affected by Robert's actions illustrated God's unfathomable forgiveness, in stark contrast to the darkness of evil of the revenge against God that occurred. Now, grief was indeed present in the families, but in all of that, the Amish demonstrated an unearthly acceptance of what happened and a resignation to God for allowing it to occur. Concerning this notion of being angry at God, one Amish mother remarked, "That was the last thing we would have thought of. That is the last thing we would have thought of." So now allow me to share a faith-inspiring moment from this heartbreak at Nickel Mines. My wife asked me to try to tone it down a little bit because the last time I brought this through, it was quite upsetting. The tragedy brought out humiliating reports of Christ-like sacrifice. Once Roberts told the girls he was going to shoot them all, one of the schoolgirls began negotiating with Roberts, pleading with him, basically telling him that she wanted to go first. Her younger sister quickly added that she wanted to go second, out of sacrificial love for the other children. Perhaps they were hoping to appease his lust for violence through their own deaths. This horrible event brought an extremely vivid picture of Satan's true nature, an unmasking of sorts. Our sense of awareness of the spiritual war that we face, it tends to get clouded over time. We complacently get used to evil coexisting in our lives, such that we lose discernment and we can even stop perceiving evil in the many of its ways it manifests itself in our lives. It's not until events like this massacre take place that we are abruptly reminded of Satan's true nature, awakened to see how much his fingerprints are present all around us, even in our own hearts. It is then that we are reminded of the true face of evil, evil that we've allowed ourselves to become complacent around. Now we get to the question of why bad things happen to innocent people. The Amish do not feel that they are in a position to announce what God must do, or even what God will do. They expect nothing less than a mystery, and thus they need no explanations on why bad things happen to good people. The simple fact that God allowed it to happen is sufficient for them, and to anyone who trusts in God's all-knowing wisdom. God does not cause evil, but as the book of Job describes, God sometimes holds back his restraining hand, even while knowing how severe the heartache is going to be. That said, God appeared to have intervened at Nickel Mines because other facets of Robert's evil plan were thwarted. The event provided a perfect canvas upon which to paint a beautiful, albeit heartbreaking picture of unearthly, heavenly forgiveness. Few things illustrate God's grace and mercy than seeing someone extend forgiveness for murdering their beloved child. But isn't that what our Father did at the cross? Such expressions of forgiveness from the Amish did not come randomly. You cannot conjure up such genuine manifestations of mercy for such life-shattering tragedies on the spur of the moment. Rather, it flows historically from their Anabaptist history, in which literal forgiveness and grace are highly esteemed and encouraged among them, by the examples of suffering and forgiveness exemplified by their forebears in their faith, who died torturous deaths for their beliefs, often while asking God to forgive those who were putting them to death. It was common for their martyrs to ask God to forgive their persecutors or to sing hymns while burning at the stake. And this irritated the Catholic authorities so much that they ordered the executioners to stuff bags of gunpowder in their mouth of the one being executed. So these are the stories that the Amish grew up on, and they still hear to this day from their ministers preaching. So a culture of humility and forgiveness is ingrained in them from early childhood. Now, these families wanted nothing to do with revenge, not even remembrance. They understood what Roberts did. It had not slipped past God. They understood that what Roberts did had not slipped past God. So in that, they take a different view of adversity. Unlike many who believe that God will deliver them from adversity, the Amish believe that God will deliver them through adversity. In other words, even if the outcome of the trial was different from what they would have hoped for, they believe God will be there from the beginning, right through to the end, despite whatever adversity he allows to come upon them. We saw this in Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and Daniel, and also with the early Christian martyrs, who greatly desired to see the cup of violence pass from them, yet who accepted their fate nonetheless. The Amish culture's willingness to forgo vengeance does not undo the tragedy, nor does it eternally pardon the wrong, but it constitutes a first step toward a future that is more hopeful. God certainly knew this atrocity was going to happen, but he allowed it for some reason. In their sorrow, the families assured Robert's relatives that they held no hard feelings toward them. They also showered kindness and pity upon the gunman's grieving family, toward Robert's wife, who was now a grief-stricken widow, who had to live with the nightmares of what the terrible thing that her husband did. And even though Roberts was dead, they also expressed forgiveness towards him. In that, we learn that forgiveness is not only for the one that we're forgiving, who often could care less, or in this case was already dead, but forgiveness eternally benefits the one who forgives. Part of forgiveness involves trying to forget. Rather than leave the school building as a memorial to this heinous act, they had it torn down at night, 8 days after the shooting, leaving an empty pasture. The monetary value of the otherwise functional building was of no account. The healing and forgiveness process required that the building go away. The new school was built on another site down the road with a layout and appearance that was as different as possible from the original. So what divine purpose could such tragedies possibly serve? What divine purpose could such tragedies possibly serve? You know, we can read about evil and how Satan prowls about like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour, about his craftiness and his deceitful ways. We can teach a lesson from the pulpit on the need to be forgiving. But to genuinely grasp the depth of what true radical forgiveness looks like and to unmask Satan, few things can match a heart-rending illustration like Nickel Mines to expose Satan's true character and vividly contrast that with God's type of forgiveness. This is one of the high points of the sermon that I want everyone to keep in mind. Suffering is perhaps the only venue through which certain eternally critical matters can be effectively taught. Suffering is perhaps the only venue through which certain eternally critical matters can be effectively taught. And forgiveness is an eternally critical matter. Jesus could not have been any plainer when he said, "For if you forgive others for their transgressions, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others, then your Father will not forgive your transgressions." We don't need a fancy Bible commentary to understand this plain message of forgiveness from Jesus himself. Forgiveness isn't hard to understand. It's just hard to do at times. But God says it's critical to forgive others if you ever hope to be forgiven. I thought this sign was quite fitting. Some people who refuse to forgive are hoping that some terrible payback will befall the one they're unwilling to forgive. If you can't read that from where you're sitting, it says customer service. Suppose we refund your money, give you another one for free, close the store and have the manager shot. Would that be satisfactory? Sometimes people who refuse to forgive will think, well, he didn't apologize in a way that I thought he was really sorry, so he doesn't deserve my forgiveness. Well, when you think about it, none of us deserve God's forgiveness, not one of us. And to say, I will forgive, and yet in your heart you think, yeah, but you owe me big time. That's not forgiveness, not at all. Rather, it's the parable of the unforgiving slave being played out in one's life. All of us were forgiven an insane amount of lifelong sins by God, an insane amount. Yet when we refuse to forgive someone, that sets our life on a course for hell, not to mention that it ruins our life on earth. I'll mention here, I know a brother who had a hard time forgiving someone, and I don't remember the details, but this just went on for a while, and it was eating him alive. One day he said, I'm just done with this. He called up the fellow who had a hard time forgiving, and he just told him, I forgive you, I love you. Basically, they talked through it, and it changed the relationship. And that man's life just turned around. His countenance, even his financial situation, it's like God had opened up the floodgates of blessing to him after he came to the point that he was willing to forgive. God was waiting for that point that he was willing to forgive the man. And it changed his life after he did so. One of the Amish grandfathers, who was the reluctant subject of a television interview following the shooting, standing with the camera unseen behind him, was asked whether he had forgiven. In my heart, yes, he replied. So when the interviewer prodded more, asking, how is that possible? The answer was short, with God's help. Yet another question brought from the Amishman the explanation, we have to forgive because Christ forgave us. If it takes a school shooting and the forgiveness God wants us all to exemplify, modeled by a religious group who demonstrates how to forgive, then God staying his hand from stopping such a tragedy could very well be an act of mercy, a divine illustration for those who are not forgiving as they should. A divine illustration where God is trying to wake people up from the sin of not forgiving others with the hope that we will recognize our unforgiving hearts and will forgive, no matter how hard we think it is to do so. So are we beginning to see an eternal purpose in tragedies? Are we beginning to see an eternal purpose in tragedies? A vivid picture like this can be worth 1,000 words. So maybe the reason God allows an innocent girl to be abducted and later her body found in the woods just might be because there are countless other young girls who are living carelessly, giving no thought of tomorrow or of where they're going to spend eternity. So that abduction could be a wake-up call for them. And the reason God allows the faithful, believing 35-year-old mother of 4 children to fall victim to deadly cancer just might be because there are countless other young mothers who are living selfishly for themselves, neglecting the calling God has laid upon them, not giving attention to where their children will spend eternity. And they need a blunt reminder from above that this could have been them. The reason God allows the Hitlers, Lenins, Mao Zedongs of this world to rise to power just might be because too many people look to men and government as their gods, as their saviors, who deceitfully make empty promises, promises they never intend to keep, promises their system of government can't even deliver on. Revelation 6 reveals that even when in God's presence, not all of man's questions will be answered, even among those who had been slain because of the word. So if they have questions while in the presence of the Almighty, assuredly we will have even more questions while still on earth. So what should be our response when we're called to suffer? That's the reason I used the example of the Amish nickel mines shooting. Their Anabaptist history was filled with accounts of terrible persecution. And their Book of Martyrs, it's called the Martyr's Mirror, recorded how their ancestors strove to meet that persecution with the same forgiving spirit as did early Christian martyrs. Their sermons over the past 500 years frequently encouraged them to face life with a non-resistant, forgiving spirit. So it comes as less of a surprise that a tragic event that would send most people into a vengeful fury was in their case met by grief, grace, and forgiveness. And so herein lies another lesson for us. We become proficient at the attitudes and convictions which we keep alive in our hearts. We become proficient at the attitudes and convictions which we keep alive in our hearts. If we get infuriated when a driver tailgates us for very long in traffic, or someone spreads an untruth about us, how will we ever forgive someone if, God forbid, we ever face the persecutions of the early Christians, or what the Chinese, North Korean, and Iranian believers face? If we fail to remain true to Christ in the little daily struggles, how can we ever remain faithful if we face the mental or physical torments of the flesh? It's these lower level tests that prepare us for the bigger tests. He who is faithful in little, he who is faithful in little is faithful in that which is much. I was thinking this morning about irritation, having an irritable spirit, and how counter that is to having a forgiven spirit. I think I was irritated about something on the road. Pothole they didn't fill or something, but I'm just thinking, someone who's always irritable about other people, that's not a forgiving spirit. So learning how to forgive really starts with having a Christ-like attitude toward others, a realistic attitude toward others. Consider how we look at the unsaved. Decades ago, I recall bemoaning how people in the world were acting. And another Christian man looked at me and he said quite matter-of-factly, those people are in the world. What else would you expect? If we expect the world to act like Christ, we are going to be greatly offended and upset when they don't. So let's be realistic about those who have no interest in submitting to Christ. They're going to do things to take advantage of us, to hurt us, and to go against all that we believe in. To expect otherwise is actually quite irrational, and that makes it harder to forgive them when they do misuse us. When Jesus was crucified at the hands of those who did not believe in him, he said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Now they knew they were crucifying a man claiming to be God's son. What they didn't know is that Jesus truly was God's son. Again, learning how to forgive starts with having a Christ-like attitude toward others. So let's consider next how we look at our fellow Christians and how our expectations concerning our brethren can affect our willingness to forgive them when things go sideways in those relationships. Now, it really helps to acknowledge that life can be messy at times. There are things we've done that in looking back in retrospect, we would have handled differently. But we set ourselves up for relational difficulty when we demand perfection in those around us. And we fail to extend grace when people mess up. When we won't forgive, we're expecting everyone around us to be absolutely perfect and to never, never mess up in a way that affects us negatively. Be assured of this: whenever people live in community, someone is going to mess up. You will never change this dynamic on earth. The only thing we can control is how we respond. Now, maybe I'm being Captain Obvious in saying this, but we all have different opinions, different approaches to life, different levels of wisdom, biblical knowledge, and ways of applying God's teachings. Now, while Jesus did pray that we'd all be one, being unified in heart doesn't mean that we're carbon copies of one another, having identical thoughts and identical approaches to life. Instead, look at unity in heart as a state of mind. Look at unity in heart as a state of mind, as the soil in which peace and love flourish, and it's the only soil where forgiveness can exist. The seed whose fruit is righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. Even Paul and Barnabas had a sharp disagreement over whether to take Mark along on the mission trip. And I'm thankful that that account is recorded for us, because it shows that even two men whom we hold up as godly examples had their moments of disagreement. And yet we know that they forgave each other, as evidenced later in Paul's life when he requested to have Mark come to him. So if we fail to appreciate that our brethren might see something differently than we do, we're setting ourselves up for some bitter moments, such that when someone counters our desires, we think, how dare she, or how dare he? This makes forgiveness in those conflict situations all the more difficult. Romans 14:23 warns us, whatever is not from faith is sin. We go before God with our beliefs. And if our beliefs are worth anything, we can be pretty sure about them. And that dynamic alone introduces opportunities for conflict. And that leads to hurt, and hence for the need for forgiveness. So the point is, the ability to offer godly forgiveness depends a lot on the front end of how we see one another, how we see others, and the reasonableness of our expectations for our relationships. Another upfront attitude that properly orients our heart concerning suffering and indirectly affects our willingness to forgive is our attitude concerning suffering. So our attitude concerning suffering can indirectly affect our willingness to forgive. We see that Roberts mishandled the suffering he went through concerning the death of his child. This led to increasing bitterness toward God and eventually to tragedy. Now, in contrast, the Amish community handled suffering in a godly way, leading to healing. What makes it easier for the Amish to forgive was how their history guides their present. It guides their religious and cultural expectations surrounding suffering. They expect suffering. They expect it as part of life in this broken world. They don't view this earth as heaven. If you recall an earlier sermon I gave on being pilgrims and strangers, our response to sorrows, the sorrows of life, will be softened by God's grace when our hope is firmly and daily planted in heaven. Are we not pilgrims and strangers in a foreign land? Is not our home in heaven? Isn't being with God our ultimate goal? What is life that we should plant our hopes and our dreams upon this earth? And are we so privileged that we should be spared the turmoil that believers in other parts of the world are experiencing, that Christians of the early centuries endured? This admonition to them, to the brethren of the first century, ought to be the model for our faith. For you, brethren, became imitators of the churches of God in Christ Jesus that are in Judea, for you also endured the same sufferings at the hands of your own countrymen, even as they did from the Jews, who both killed the Lord Jesus and the prophets and drove us out. So it's a forgiving mindset that accepts suffering as a realistic part of life. And suffering, it acts like a refining fire, as it helps to reduce our affection for this world and sharpens our pilgrim hearts to yearn for an eternity with God, where there will be no more suffering. And in that, we find another purpose in suffering. Jesus sorrowed every day. He sorrowed every day as he warred against the flesh to overcome temptation, so that he could remain victorious as a sinless sacrifice. Now, resisting temptation requires an ongoing, emotionally taxing confrontation between the flesh and the spirit. It is emotionally taxing to have that battle going on. Galatians 5:17 says, for the flesh sets its desire against the spirit, and the spirit against the flesh, for these two are in opposition to one another, so that you may not do the things you please. Extending forgiveness is one of those disciplines of the Spirit. Extending forgiveness is a discipline of the Spirit that is necessary in the battle against the flesh. Our flesh doesn't want to forgive. Don't lose that battle between the flesh and the Spirit. Don't lose that battle. What made the account of the Amish responding to the massacre so unforgettable for me is that such forgiveness seems so rare. But God would not have forgiveness to be rare among his people. In fact, forgiveness is at the very core of who we are as imitators of Christ. It is at the very core of our faith. Matthew 6:15, if you do not forgive others, then your Father will not forgive your transgressions. I'm going to close with this. A man's truck broke down deep in the desert, so he started walking back to town. His water bottle ran out a long time ago, and now he was feeling desperate. Through the tall brush, he noticed a cabin he had not seen earlier, so he walked towards it. As he neared the cabin, he saw a well with an old hand pump. He frantically began pumping the handle, but nothing came out. Then he noticed a metal lid in the dirt next to the well. He dug around it, and he found a mason jar full of water, along with a note. The note said, "Do not drink this water. Only use it to prime the pump. If you heed this warning, you will have all the water you want from this good well. But if instead you drink the water from the jar, you will eventually die from thirst. Refill the jar and bury it with this note for the next person." Forgiveness is just like that. If in our Christian walk we find ourselves unwilling to forgive someone, it's like we drank all the water from the mason jar and we didn't fill the jar back up for the benefit of others. To the one who refuses to forgive, the cup of forgiveness that we received when we were baptized, that will be the last taste of forgiveness that we'll ever enjoy. That's my lesson for this morning. As we sing the invitation song, if there's something pressing heavy on your heart, you're welcome to come forward as we stand and sing.